Well, today we're talking about the madness of crowds and the search for identity. Douglas Murray and Esther O'Reilly are my guests on the show today. Douglas Murray, a well-known author, speaker and journalist whose latest book, The Madness of Crowds, critiques modern ideologies around gender, race, sexuality and trans issues. As an atheist, he nevertheless believes that large parts of society are losing their way in the absence of religious narratives that perhaps once gave people identity and purpose. It'll be interesting to trace that a little on today's show. Esther O'Reilly is a maths PhD student and blogger who describes herself as a Christian humanist. She writes at The Old Fogey at the Patheos Network, and as well as being one of the leading Christian commenters on the Jordan Peterson phenomenon, she's also a huge Douglas Murray fan herself. So welcome along to the show, both Douglas and Esther. Douglas, as first time for you on the programme. Great to have you on. Been long wanting to get you on the show, and this book has provided the opportunity. Let's dive right in. You sometimes call yourself a Christian atheist. Before we talk about the book, what do you mean by calling yourself a Christian atheist?
Well, first of all, it's a great pleasure to be with you for the first time and to be speaking with you both. My view is that there are different types of atheism, and atheists should basically admit as much. Atheism being a non-belief, as it were, it means that you will have along the way have scooped up and inherited a whole set of beliefs, whether you were brought up a Muslim and then lost your faith. You will have some bits of the Muslim faith and community feelings within you still, and you will be slightly different from a person who has no longer believes in God but was brought up a Christian. That person will be different from someone in a similar situation who is a Hindu, and so on. So just because you can't, don't, won't, whatever the case is, believe in the truth claims of a religion, doesn't mean that you've shrugged it off, doesn't mean you've lost it all, and is very likely to mean that many of your preconceptions about the world, some of your foundations, will remain deeply part of the religion from which you come. I do slightly more than that myself, which is to say, not only have I come from those roots, but I like, love, and indeed cherish those roots. So saying I'm a Christian atheist is a sort of a nod to that in a way. It's to say I'm first of all not existing in a vacuum, and secondly, don't believe that somebody who doesn't happen to believe in the truth claims of religion, nevertheless, doesn't mean that I hate it, loathe it, or in any way want to wage war against it.
And you were, I mean, I think until your early 20s, a confirmed Anglican. So in a sense, that's been part of your heritage, obviously. I mean, we could probably get into some of the reasons why you obviously left that behind eventually in the rest of the programme. But it's interesting to hear you say all that, because it obviously does strike a difference to the typical sort of new atheist kind of view where religion is both false and evil. You obviously can't get on board with it being true, but you certainly don't see it as an evil force in society.
Well, firstly, I just caveat that. I mean, it's not getting on board with it being true. It's being able to agree with the certain of the fundamentals which you have to agree with in order to call yourself a believing a Christian. That doesn't mean that I don't think Christianity is in some way true. So it's not to that extent about truth as such. And as for the new atheists, yes, I mean, I happen to, I think, know all of the new atheists, and I suppose one place I've always diverged from them is the fact that I think that religion can be the cause of all sorts of sources of evil, but my own experience and feelings about this have always been that absolutely everything can turn to evil. Every form of politics, every form of belief. So I don't find the sort of running through the lists of evil things that religion has done and religious people have done to be especially illuminating or unusual to that extent.
Well, we're going to talk about the book, and perhaps that'll draw us back into talking about the place of especially Christian belief and the narratives that Christianity once gave people during the course of the
Mm.
program today. Great to have you on the show today, Douglas. Thanks for joining us. Esther O'Reilly joins us also. Esther, you're a writer yourself, and I know a huge fan of Douglas's writing. What's drawn you particularly to what Douglas has to say in the last year or two?
Yeah, so first of all, just a quick correction. It's actually the young fogey.
Oh, the young fogey. I got that wrong.
Yes, yes.
Wow, sorry.
No problem, no problem.
And that is
Although
because you are very young, Esther, it should be said.
Yes, though I feel quite old.
Well,
which
I was
think
going to say, you're kind of like, you've somehow been supplanted from the 19th century into the early 21st century.
Yes, I think Douglas can relate, perhaps. Perhaps we share this in common with everything else. So anyway, so briefly, I first discovered Douglas in the summer of 2018 when I was preparing to cover the dialogues between Jordan Peterson and Sam Harris. I was being sort of sucked into that whole vortex, which ended up sort of making me such as I am. And so I hadn't come across Douglas's work before, but I quickly became an admirer of his books and articles and lectures and things. And I quickly came to feel that we had a number of commonalities. We seemed to speak the same dying language in some sense. We had some similar research obsessions, research interests, research styles, and writing styles. And importantly, too, I think we share the same philosophy of writing. I'm always quoting Joseph Conrad that the task of the writer is to give the reader a glimpse of that truth for which he has forgotten to ask. And so Douglas's ingrained addiction to truth-telling, which ensures that he will never have a career in politics, is something I appreciate and admire greatly in his work and something I aspire to in my own.
You obviously come at this as a Christian yourself, Esther. And in a sense, I think you've been seeing and navigating where the intellectual dark web, as it's sometimes called, Jordan Peterson, Sam Harris and others, and Douglas as well, are all intersecting with certain Christian themes. So it's an interesting time, isn't it? Because a lot of those boundaries, again, between the new atheism, are kind of being redrawn because people are having different kinds of conversations at the moment.
Yes, I would definitely agree there.
Look, let's get into the discussion, folks, because I don't want to waste any more time because we really should talk about the madness of crowds. Douglas, I was speaking to one church leader recently who's reading your book, and they said to me, how does he get away with it? Was the question. They really enjoying the book, but said, how on earth does he get to say these things and not get into terrible trouble for it? So what's the secret? Are you getting into terrible trouble for the things you're saying in The Madness of Crowds?
Well, it doesn't feel like it. I occasionally get asked by people, do you enjoy lobbing grenades into the public square, as it were? And I say, it doesn't feel like that. I don't feel like I'm doing anything all that, all that naughty, all that unusual. I mean, I don't know. I mean, I don't spend very much time sort of analyzing my life from the outside. But the way I see it, I just have always written about whatever I'm very interested in. And I suppose I am slightly drawn to taboo subjects or subjects which aren't written about or are difficult to write about in some way. I find it something, I suppose there's some pattern in that. It's not really for me to say whether I do get away with things or not. Who knows? I mean, maybe I do, maybe I don't. I'm in a poor position to be the judge of that. I think that one thing I do hear quite often is that I say things that other people feel that if they were to say, they would get into terrible trouble for. But I think that might not be a unique thing to do with me. Rather, it's to do with the particular way in which people's careers and the way people's careers are set up now, which is that most people are in a position where to say certain things, even things we all know to be true or knew to be true till yesterday, is to make you vulnerable to, for instance, I don't know, the obvious one is some online petition getting going because people online have decided they're offended by it, and then writing to your employers, and your employers then asking you not to do this sort of thing. I think that happens in academia, it happens in government, obviously local government, it happens in private corporations now. So I think there's a fairly small class of person, among whom perhaps I'm one, who is for various weird reasons in a position that we can say what we see to be the case without that sort of fear of recrimination. That isn't to say there's no fear of recrimination or backlash or anything else. And obviously you don't just shoot off and say any old crazy stuff. But I mean, it's to say that as long as you're not vulnerable to that sort of mob fragility, then yes, I think it's you can say things that others can't.
I was going to say as well, does the fact that you at least have one of the, if you like, camps, if you like, that are outlined in this book, as it were, as one of your identities, let's say, you're gay, does that kind of give you a sort of the ability to speak at least with some authority in that area? Because one of the issues that so often comes about in this sort of area is that, well, if you are not yourself one of these particular classes of identity, you'd have no right to have an opinion on it, sort of thing. So well, does that make a difference?
Well, obviously the worst thing to be in the world is the white heterosexual male, because a white heterosexual male obviously should just never speak, because they've spoken before historically, so they aren't allowed to now. So yes, at least I don't have that terrible set of complete disabilities. No, I actually don't think it gives me much. I don't seek for it to give me anything, obviously. But I mean, I said this in a conversation recently with Lionel Shriver in London, who asked me a similar question. I said, look, The Guardian has never said, hey, let's give Douglas a good write-up. He's gay, I wouldn't expect it. I don't expect it. But I am struck by the fact that these things, like I know enough Black people who happen to say things that aren't ticking all the boxes they're meant to tick, who in the same way, it's not they have any particular worse deal. It's not like they get any credit for happening to be of an ethnic minority. My view is that all of this stuff is about, you're simply meant to say the things that conform to the era. And if you do, and you happen to have a minority trait, then that's great. But if you don't say those things and you have that same trait, then it doesn't get you any time off in purgatory.
It might be worth pointing out at this point, Esther, that you, in a sense, are one of those people who have chosen to some extent to keep your true identity under wraps. You go under a pen name on your blog. We're not going to be showing your face on this video and so on. And that's partly because you yourself are writing similar sorts of issues to Douglas, but you do have an academic career which you feel could ultimately be imperiled if someone chose to sort of be offended at some of the things you write.
Well, I mean, it is rather, when you look at job listings for all manner of things, sometimes they'll list, what is your commitment to diversity and inclusion, or, you must have this as one of your job requirements, besides being able to, teach and research and all that. Minor trivialities. So yes, this absolutely is the case. And I was just thinking, so Andrew Klavan is a popular American commentator. His son Spencer is also gay, but quite a maverick. And I saw the other day he was expressing an opinion about something. He said, look, see, I'm waving my magic gay wand. This gives me the ability to have an opinion about this thing. But the magic wand of gayness, for some strange reason, doesn't seem to work if it's a conservative holding the wand. And so, of course, I have my woman card. See, I'm holding it right here. And,
the minority woman card, of course.
Exactly. And Douglas, when I reviewed your book for Art Digital, I was saying something positive about your comments on motherhood, which I quite appreciate. And I said, well, I'm in the properly privileged position to give a gay man's opinions on motherhood my womanly stamp of approval. So I don't pull that out very often because, like Douglas, I don't think it really matters. And I'd like to just be good and not be good as a woman. Which, when Lionel said that, she said, people come up to her and say, "Oh, you're my favorite female novelist." She says, "That's an insult." I'm sorry. Just So. Yeah.
So why in your view, Douglas, and we're getting to the heart of the book now here, have people chosen to choose to, I suppose, put themselves out there within a particular identity? Why has identity politics become so important of late? In a way, as you say in the book, civil rights leaders like Martin Luther King Jr. might never have imagined when they were making their speeches about, asking people to be judged by the content of their character rather than the colour of their skin. Suddenly, colour of their skin, sexuality, gender has all become terribly important. What's at the bottom of all of this, Douglas?
Well, there's lots of things. I mean, one is brute politics, which I identify in each chapter. Just people who want to win a particular, usually far left political argument and use a minority characteristic as a battering ram to achieve that aim. That's a significant portion of people. And I think they're obviously the drivers, those people. There are, however, a larger number of people who I think are simply drawn to it because we all have to find identity groupings somewhere, whether we like it or not. It's just observable of the species at this stage that we can't and don't just float in the air as sort of autonomous beings. And when people say, we should only judge people by the content of their character, as Martin Luther King did, I said that's exactly right. However, there's clearly a temptation to skip that and go to the easier bits, the easier ways of doing things, of judging people by characteristics. And that seems to be, if not an indelible thing, then it's incredibly hard to erase. And I should just add that, I mean, from the outside, it looks completely deranged, because if somebody said to you, I just love black people, is it well, why or who, or like why particularly, who are you thinking of? And if they said, I just love white people, you'd say, but why? I'm like, who are you thinking of? In the same way, actually, as if somebody said, I hate all, straight people. Who are you thinking of? I love all straight people, but I know some awful ones and some great ones. And it's the same in all of these things. It's like if somebody said to you, I just love women's minds. And you go, but which ones? There are some great ones, like there are great male minds, and there are some total car wrecks. Why are you putting them all in the same group? Because they happen to come from the same sex or chromosome arrangement. And I think it's, if you put it like this, it's a completely deranged way of trying to understand humankind and our fellow human beings. And yet it has become one of the dominant, if not the dominant, shorthand way. People standing up and saying, speaking as a 1, 2, 3. And I think, like Esther, my objection to this is, if your question or your answer has any truth or validity to it, it'll be there whatever your characteristics. And so I say all this as a long-winded answer to say, we obviously find it hard not to align ourselves along some kind of lines like this. And in the absence of speaking as a British man, which again, by the way, I mean, sorry to hark on about this, but if you said, I love British people, I'd say, who? There are some great ones and there are some total shits. Like everything. If somebody said, in the same way, if somebody said, I just hate the French, and you say, well, who? There are some wonderful French people and some ghastly ones, of course. But why are you doing this? But the point is that that was one grouping, which we don't rely on so much anymore, nation. We don't rely so much anymore on religious grouping because there are so many of us who are on the borders of it or out of it. So this is the one that we stick with in this era.
Yeah. I mean, to what extent, Esther, do you think that what Douglas is outlining in the book in terms of the way that these various groupings have come to dominate our politics is actually a result of, I suppose, substituting identity for what was once given by religion, by especially the Christian narrative in the West?
Very much so. I think his thesis is sort of bang on. And if I could pivot to maybe a slightly more serious bit of the book and connect this back up. So he talks quite a bit about forgiveness. And there was a legal case in America where this sort of clashed with the question of racial identity in particular. And so this was the case where a white policewoman killed a black man in his own home while she was off duty. And it was this terrible case of professional negligence. And she was actually tried and convicted, but then the brother of the man that she killed made this incredible decision to stand up and forgive her in the courtroom. And it was caught on camera and people were speaking about it for weeks. But what happened in the wake of that moment was that immediately the young black man and the female cop were turned into avatars of their respective racial identities rather than being individuals. And so his act of forgiveness became an act of black forgiveness, you know. And so, of course, ignored in all of this was the fact that the female judge was herself a black woman and actually gave the policewoman her own Bible. And so she came to the verse, "For God so loved the world," and she said, "Now, Amber," this is the name of the woman, "Amber, when you read this verse and you see the world, I want you to read, 'For God so loved Amber.' You, Amber, the individual, say your name, say it." And so that judge saw Amber Geiger not as a white woman, but as an individual human being who could be redeemed by God, as did young Brant Jean, the brother of the man she killed. And so it was just this appalling thing that happened when people immediately began going around lecturing all of us about how we should feel about this moment, and immediately sort of flattening out the individuality of the people in the drama.
I'm so glad you raised that, Esther, because I was enormously struck by that case and enormously struck by the culture war that immediately went on around it and the way in which it missed immediately the most salient feature about the whole thing. My reading of it, I may be wrong on this, but my reading of it was that what happened was almost immediately that the tape came out of that extraordinary scene in court, people were immediately struck by it largely. And then within a nanosecond, there were some black commentators online who said things like, "I'm so tired of black people having to forgive white people and systemic, etc., etc." And it was just one of those times, and I can very comfortably say that I would feel this whichever way around that happened. It was just one of those times where you thought, wow, what a lot we're missing in this era, that even a moral lesson this strong gets lost into the identity politics nonsense in no seconds flat. And you know, one of the things also is that I wish that at any rate the backlash to such things just took a bit more time and we were able to reflect on the primary lesson for a bit longer, because it seems to me, as you know, my forgiveness chapter in The Madness of Crowds, I go into this in some depth, but it's just obviously multiple books just in this theme. But the striking thing about the Christian ideal of forgiveness seems to me that most of the moral lessons of Jesus of Nazareth are able to be got from a range of other sources, including sources that predate him. And that much of the lessons of the New Testament you can get from the Greeks in some form, for instance. What is the absolutely standout exception to that? It is the revolutionary moral insight of Jesus to invite people to love their enemies. Something so counterintuitive and world-changing once you suggest it, let alone try to practice it in the world, that it's that we are still filled with amazement when we see it actually practiced, because we know how incredibly hard it is to do in your life as an actual, never mind the aspiration, but to do it. I mean, the other case would be the one of the families of how many years ago, 2-3 years ago, that white supremacist in America went and shot up that black
Yes.
in the South.
Mm.
And within 24 hours, the families of the victims were out saying that they forgave their loved one's killer. And I mean, I don't think anyone can see that and not feel just awe. I mean, just awe. And you'd rather like, or I would rather like, given how rare it is in our world, and it always was, to see examples of grace that extraordinary, one would just like us to be able to linger on them a bit more. Mm-hmm. And then, sure, everyone will get going with their own personal gripes, but just to pause for a moment over these and just wonder at them.
We're going to go to a very quick break, folks. I want to pick up the issue of forgiveness again, because it is an important part of the chapter that you write in the book, Douglas, and something that I think is rather uniquely missing in a lot of the identity politics that you outline in the book as well. So we'll come back to that in a short moment's time. You're listening to Unbelievable with me, Justin Brierley. My guests are Esther O'Reilly and Douglas Murray on today's show.
What I want to invite Roger to comment on is, why couldn't the mental realm include an infinite consciousness?
It's too much like us. It's too much like putting it like the Greek views of the gods in some sense. They were too much like us.
They were finite and contingent. Here we're talking about a metaphysically necessary source.
I admire this noble aspiration to find the highest possible ideal. It's almost as if you're proposing a new religion to meet this new challenge.
It's not a new religion. Yes. What it is something that sits in the same place. It addresses some of the same needs, but it is not founded on the same principle.
If the New Testament says that Jesus did X, Y, and Z, did he do it or not?
I don't think it's a story that's made by committee. Am I going to have a later literary genius who comes up with a great story like this? Or am I going to say, no, Jesus is the genius, and somehow that story has basically been preserved?
Welcome back to today's show. We're talking about the madness of crowds and the search for identity with Douglas Murray and Esther O'Reilly. Fascinating book that you've written here, Douglas. And in some ways, I think one of the reasons why it's been so popular among many of my Christian friends, especially conservative Christian friends, actually, is that so much of what you say seems to tie in at some level to the Christian worldview. There's almost a sense in some of your wider writing as well that you almost have a Christ-haunted sort of view of the world, even as an atheist, Douglas. And I mean, from that perspective, you talk about forgiveness, as I say, in the book, and you lay out various ways in which you feel the modern movements around identity politics are very lacking in that department. But you've also written quite widely about issues around euthanasia, sanctity of life, that kind of thing. I mean, these are the kind of concerns, as I say, that typically exercise Christians most of all. But it seems like you're seriously concerned about what happens to our regard for humans in the absence of, I guess, that fundamental idea of us bearing the image of God. So do you want to sort of speak to that a little bit and what your concerns are, even as an atheist, in that respect?
Yes, I am. I'm sort of amazed that it's unusual to have these concerns. What other concerns exactly should we have? Or what concerns ought to take priority over such concerns? It seems obvious to me, reading as a historian and studying what goes wrong at times in history, it seems obvious to me that the massive problem of the secular world is always going to be how you create in the absence of the total structure of religion in your society, how you in some way recreate, shore up, or otherwise mold an impression of the Christian idea of the sanctity of the individual. And I say that because, as I say actually at one point in The Madness of Crowds, it's very obvious from a moment's consideration that people are not equal, that we're not equally beautiful, we're not equally tall, we're not equally fast at running or good at jumping, we're not equally good at baseball, basketball, football, cricket, or anything else. We're not equally intelligent. We're not equally caring or thoughtful, and a whole lot more. So when people say all people are equal, you've got to say, well, in which ways are you thinking? Now, we have the idea of equality under the law that has deep enough foundations, I think, that that's not under particular threat in countries like America or Britain. But the idea of equality as in something like anything like equality in the eyes of God seems to me to be a real vulnerability of the godless worldview. And as I say, I just think it's an obvious trap to point to and warn people about. And occasionally, I mean, most atheists really hate it when I say this, because they, like everybody, nobody likes their flaws being pointed out. Nobody likes their dirty linen being washed in public. And I just think that there is an unpopularity to pointing out big problems, because if you point them out, you've got to do several things. One option is to address them. Another is to concede you can't. And I don't know what the answer is, but I know that is one to point to.
I mean, you were, I think, struck by one of the examples in the book, Esther, of the young trans Belgian woman. Just tell us that story for those who aren't familiar with it and how it keys into this issue of the sanctity of life.
Sure. Yeah. So this is the case of a young woman named Nancy Verhelst in Belgium, who grew up in a quite hellish, dysfunctional family situation. She had all brothers. Her parents were quite harsh and neglectful. And so she became confused and decided she would try to become a man and see if that helped anything. It didn't. She was depressed, and the state gently escorted her to the grave. And, Douglas, I paid you a compliment in my review of your book. I called you an equal opportunity humanist, because when you wrote about this case, you can palpably sense, I think, how much you cared about this poor young woman, and how sort of almost desperately you wished that she had been able to find love. And her case is sort of at the juncture of all of these issues of sanctity and euthanasia. I remember reading a quite heated debate that you had with a colleague at The Spectator who was rather glib about all of this, and his motto was "Make death easier to access." And you said, "Oh yes, what a beautiful slogan!" Quite. And one of my earliest political memories is the death of Terri Schiavo. She went into a coma as a young woman and never came out of it, and her husband successfully had her killed against the wishes of her family. So I was having a debate with a humanist minister on this very program, actually, and we began talking about what constitutes the value of a human being. And he was trotting out his little list of, we think, we have desires, we this, we that, we communicated. This is what constitutes the value of the human person. So I, being a bit rude, perhaps, I asked him whether perhaps Terri Schiavo was 3/5 of a person, because she didn't have all of those qualities while she was in a coma. And so this is the thing. We need to reevaluate what the measure of a man is, and we need to recognize that these things do not constitute the value of a human being, but rather they evidence it. And as Aristotle says, acting follows being. And Aristotle, of course, not even a Christian, but you could begin to even find your way in through the natural light, I think.
I mean, you were saying earlier, Douglas, that you think that some of these aspects of values that we have enshrined in our culture obviously come down to us from Christianity, but also possibly from other cultures as well that predate that. To some extent, though, is your worry that in the absence of any future Christian narrative, we may altogether dispense with these ideas and with what has traditionally we've thought makes someone human and makes a life worth living and so on?
Well, yes. I mean, on the widest possible level, it's just extremely easy to foresee in the future, as it has been in the past, how whole groups of people can be regarded as being some kind of, dead weight on the advancement of the species for those people who will always believe in advancement and so on. And so I get worried about the whole area in a way. I'm just astounded that more people are not, because I see no, as I think I've said before, I see no evidence that we're becoming enormously better as human beings than we've ever been before, contra to the brilliant arguments put forward by Steven Pinker in The Better Angels of Our Nature, among other places. And I think that most people who argue for a sort of form of moral progress have to ignore really large things, like in the 20th century, 2 world wars, the sort of the but gaps are quite big in that argument. So of course I'm worried about it on the widest level, but I'm worried about it on the individual level as well, because of the consequence of cases like the one that Esther just referred to, that I referred to, the Belgian case. You see, one of the things I'm concerned about in this is that something like that could happen. The moment I read about that case, and I only caught up with it when the male, the female to male transsexual in question, Nathan Verhelst, had been euthanized by the Belgian state. Now, I already have quite developed views about euthanasia because I've spoken to quite a lot of euthanasia doctors. I've studied it. I've traveled around on the continent in those countries where it is legal. And the moment I read about that case, that was one of the case. That's the sort of thing that we were told wouldn't happen with euthanasia. It was only going to be people with a few months left to live with terminal cancer and people with extreme dementia and so on. This was exactly the sort of thing we were told it wouldn't be, and it is. And there seems to be no particular outcry or note of it. And that's why when things like that happen, I sort of say, but why aren't people focusing on this? And why aren't we focusing on the number of things that have happened even before the euthanasia bit of that argument that should be deeply troubling to people, such as, what are we doing when we say to people that they can approximate the body of the opposite sex and actually be of the opposite sex and become the opposite sex and therefore solve themselves in some way? What is the solving bit of that? What are we ourselves that we are trying to solve? And is it remotely possible? And why would a society hold out that hope if we weren't really certain about it, let alone do medical experiments, which in that case failed and have such catastrophic consequences? I'm just struck by the number of questions behind a case like that just aren't asked or thought about, and we sort of wave it aside. And as I say, I think that future generations will look at something like that and say, what were they thinking?
Yeah.
What were they thinking?
What's your take on it, Esther?
Oh, well, I would say that all of these things are connected by our society's sort of Gnostic divorce of the body from the soul. That the human body in and of itself is no longer seen as a vessel of dignity in some sense. And so we're saying, well, the body is material. You can sort of shape it. You can cut bits of it off. You can do what you like with it, while your spirit or your soul is sort of off doing its own thing. And so it's this great divorce of body and soul, and that it not only could you change from one sex to another. You could kill it if you liked. And then we see that at the margins of life with the developing form in the womb, and then also the body on the brink of death. Well, it's like, well, we're just keeping a corpse alive. That's a sort of language that's being...
It's an interesting kind of... Sorry, go ahead, Douglas.
Can I just leap in to say that there's a further separation than the one that even Esther identifies with, that Gnostic separation, which is the separation within the idea of the self. So as well as the sort of body soul, let's say, separation, the idea that there can be two selves that are allowed to operate simultaneously, and one is the self we imagine ourselves to be, and the other is the one that is practiced in the world. And I'm repeatedly, increasingly struck in our society by the fact that these two do not need to be in any alignment. My friend Theodore Dalrymple, as he writes under the name of Anthony Daniels, has many examples of this, extreme examples, obviously, but from his work as a prison doctor, of people with for instance, he gives a famous example in one essay of a man who threw acid in his girlfriend's face, and that was why he was in prison. And Dalrymple asks why he says he didn't do this. Dalrymple subsequently discovers that the man had been in prison before for precisely the same an offense, and says to the prisoner, "Why did you say that you had not thrown acid in your girlfriend's face when you have been in prison before for precisely the same offense?" And the man's response was, "It's not who I am." And actually, of course, now this is an extreme example. You see, in his mind, he was probably all sorts of things. He was, for instance, a loyal boyfriend, looked after his women, that sort of thing. He had an idea of himself, but the self that lived in the world was this monstrous person.
Right.
Whereas his view of himself was a different thing. Now, I mentioned this extreme example, but that's not that uncommon. Perhaps never was, that we have a sense of who we are, an idea of the sort of person we are, that needn't remotely align with the person in the world, because we are positively encouraged to have this idea of the person that we are.
Yes, deep down.
Even if it doesn't relate to the person we actually are.
And arguably, I think, Esther, it's almost a funnily religious impulse in a fairly post-Christian world, which is going back to a sort of folk religion or New Age religion where, I've got to be true to my true self, and therefore I can speak of myself as having some kind of, alternative spiritual existence from the one that's manifestly the one I'm actually acting out. But I mean, what do you believe Christianity has to say? I mean, is it a spent force now that simply can't answer any of these various issues that are raising up in society, Esther? Where do we go with this if you are a Christian in your case?
Well, I think there's a beautiful passage by Agatha Christie in the introduction to her autobiography where she's talking about the true self and the whole self. And she's looking at these sort of snapshots of herself. Here I am as a little girl. Here I am as a young woman. Here I am in middle age as an old woman. And she says the true self is known only to God. And so I think, I certainly do not think that Christianity is played out. I think it's as vibrant and robust as ever, a framework within which to find ourselves again and to find meaning. And fundamentally, what Christianity offers is the identity. It's like what the black judge was offering to Amber Geiger, for God so loved Amber, right? And this is the identity that is rooted in Christ, no longer in your gender, your race, these other sort of identity markers, although those things are all gathered up in the hand of the Creator in some sense. But Uber alles is who the man that Christ will make you, and so that's where I think we need to turn. And when I look at somebody like Greta Thunberg, for instance, who will say, well, before I began my climate activism, my life had no meaning. I had no purpose. I just sat around miserable all day, but now I have meaning. I thought about this, and I'm quite pro-life, but if I saw a young pro-life teenager saying, before I began my pro-life activism, I had no meaning, now I have meaning. I would say there's something not right about that, because no cause, no activism can take that place. It should be embedded in a hierarchy of meaning making, with I think ideally God at the center of it, at the top of it.
I'd go slightly further than Esther. I think that if somebody says, my life had absolutely no meaning until I discovered this particular cause, you should run 1,000,000 miles away from them. They are always and without fail dangerous people at some stage, because they are trying to replace something that is missing with an inadequate and inappropriate replacement.
Well,
and at some point that goes wrong.
Yeah, absolutely. And
the environment is not a replacement for meaning. Even literature is not a replacement for meaning. And politics in particular, as I say in the conclusion of The Madness of Crowds, politics in particular is one of the worst places for people to seek to find meaning. Because if anything lets you down routinely, predictably, always, it'll be politics.
And that leaves us with the huge question then of what do we do in this meaning crisis that we seem to have gotten ourselves into in the early 21st century? Because the fact is, I see on my social media everyone looking for meaning in these various causes, in identities, in politics, and routinely being disappointed when everyone turns out doesn't A, agree with them, and B, that very often it doesn't end up giving what they think it will give. Now, we're putting on our evangelist hat at this point, Douglas, and doing a bit of Jesus. Yeah, I was about to use that very phrase. You famously said in when you were moderating, I think it was one of those Sam Harris and Jordan Peterson debates, that there's a terrible phenomenon known as Jesus smuggling, where people try and bring in, it all points back to God, doesn't it? But I think there's a legitimate bit of Jesus smuggling to be done here, Douglas. I mean, at one level, can you see how, for someone like Esther, certainly, you could say, having laid out all of these problems in society, you could say, well, the one big thing we're missing at the centre of this is that ultimate thing that gives us meaning, that God who gives, invests humans with ultimate dignity and purpose. And could that even be an argument for that God, I suppose, is the next question I would have.
If I can say so, firstly, the difficulty of that simply being the answer is a difficulty which we've known for a very long time, which Locke, among others, writes about, which is that you can't force people to believe, or at least I don't just mean literally, sort of put them on the rack and, torture them till they say, yes, I believe in the incarnation. What I mean is you can't fake it. Mm. I mean, quite often, you'll be maybe unsurprised to hear this, but quite often Christians will say to me, but why don't you just believe? And I say, because I still have the same inability to concede certain bits of the argument, however much I recognize what happens in their absence. So as I say, you can't just say, well, look, Douglas, why don't you just go the final furlong?
Yes.
So that's the first thing. The second thing is, the question always is, I mean, to take it in sort of Hegelian terms, is whether religion, and specifically Christianity, is an exhausted or an unexhausted force. And Esther made reference to it, and obviously doesn't believe it is exhausted. I happen to think that almost everything in our metaphysical system, as I said in The Strange Death of Europe, almost everything has been wound down. But that, of course, doesn't mean that it can't be wound back up. I mean, the famous example always given about Arnold's Dover Beach is that just as the slow withdrawing roar can occur, so the tide can come back in. And I see all sorts of scenarios where even the most exhausted looking form of religion re-energizes and gets its mojo back. I absolutely can lay out exactly the situation in which that would occur, even in a country like the United Kingdom or countries in Western Europe, which are increasingly deracinated of organized Christian religion. And so that's the second thing. The third thing is one very important thing I think to stress to people in the meantime is to live their lives and engage in their lives as if it is, as I think it is, a struggle toward truth. And let me go further, a struggle towards a point. Now, you see, we know that at this stage that, again, that we as human beings are not just storytelling animals, but are meaning-seeking creatures. And therefore, there are two questions that hive off from that assumption or that assertion. The first is that we are simply meaning-seeking creatures, but that there is no meaning. The second is that we are meaning-seeking creatures because there is a meaning. Now, of the two, I myself intuit that the second is the case. Now, a lot of people would say, well, you would say that. You would assume that, wouldn't you? Because you wouldn't know if you were in the first of those two junctions. But nevertheless, I hold it to be the case. And for all sorts of reasons, there's an example that I gave in a piece I wrote about euthanasia some years ago, but when Britain was at risk of going down this route. I gave the example of the moment toward the very end of King Lear in Act 4, I think it is, at the midnight of the play, when Gloucester is already blinded and tries to kill himself. And Shakespeare does something quite extraordinary. Gloucester tries to kill himself, but the person guiding him to the edge of the cliff is, though he doesn't know it, his son in disguise. He throws himself down to what he thinks is his death, but of course it isn't his death on Dover Beach. And he only has a few minutes left to live in the play. But in that moment, after what he thought would be his death, he discovers everything. And I have a very strong instinct on this, that is not just an instinct, but a drive. And I say this to friends, I say this to people when they're depressed, I say this to people when they are listless or losing their sense of what they're meant to be doing in the world, that even just hanging on for those extra minutes might allow you to access that too. And that's worth hanging around for.
We're going to go to another quick break, and I'd love to hear Esther's response to some of those issues you raise, particularly regarding whether it's a done deal with the you can't unsee the case against God, as it were, but also some of those other fascinating points you bring about that search for meaning as well. We're talking about the madness of crowds, the search for identity. Douglas Murray and Esther O'Reilly are my guests here on Unbelievable this afternoon. Do stick around. We've got another section coming up, and we'll continue the conversation.
If you listen to Unbelievable with Justin Briley on Premier Christian Radio and enjoy the conversations between Christians and skeptics, then this is the perfect app for you. For the latest updates, podcasts, videos, articles, bonus content and much more, download the Premier Unbelievable app today.
Such an interesting conversation on today's show between Douglas Murray and Esther O'Reilly. I'll make sure there are links, of course, to both of them from today's show. If you want to go online and look it up, it's premierchristianradio.com/unbelievable. This is the programme that brings you interesting conversations every week between all kinds of different people. And in that last section, Esther, Douglas made a few very interesting and salient points. The first being that when it comes to whether he could, get back to some kind of faith in God or Christ, he says that, well, I've done the reading and I can't unsee what, John Locke and others did in terms of breaking that down, however much I might, I suppose, be very sympathetic to where it leaves us now as a society. But also perhaps, quite hopeful that there is an opportunity for Christianity to be revived in some sense, that, just as it went out on Dover Beach, the tide may yet come back in again. And just, again, some interesting points about why we choose to live. That even in those last moments, there might be a purpose. We might yet see something, and obviously his own admission that he does think there's some kind of a meaning out there. Lots to potentially respond to.
Yeah. So first of all, let me just. I loved his use of King Lear there. I thought that was extraordinarily moving and quite apt. I will say just quickly before I get into my own thoughts on faith and reason and the case for God and all that, I do think there is something to the point made by A.J. Balfour in the 19th century that in order for a creed to be consistent, there should be a harmony between the accepted value of results and the accepted theory of causes. And so, what Douglas is so movingly expressing there is that we have an accepted value of life, that life is good, that life is beautiful, that human beings are fundamentally valuable. And so I think that can be the beginning of an argument. That can be a clue that perhaps our accepted theory of causes is due for an overhaul because we don't have that harmony. We have a disconnect there between that and the value of results. But coming to Douglas's point about people who say, well, come on, why don't you just make yourself believe? Go on, like Michel Houellebecq at the Black Madonna. I sympathize with that, and I've seen that many, many times. And so that is not something that I would say, but I would rather say that faith is not meant to be a leap into the dark, but rather a step into the light, to quote one of my great heroes, John Lennox. And this is certainly how I was taught to think about faith and reason as dancing partners rather than enemies. I think that if we are rational animals, to quote the Catholic priest Matthew Power, we can no more get out of rationalism than we can get out of our own skin. And so I believe that God does deal with men as rational animals, and I think that we do in fact have quite abundant evidence to think about these things and to come to be both intellectually and spiritually satisfied.
I mean, I was going to say that I'm not very familiar with your journey on this front, Douglas, but as I say, you said at the outset you had an Anglican sort of upbringing. I think you were an organ scholar or something, even at Eton and so on. So you've sort of had that sort of Christian upbringing, if you like, in the background, and I think at one time, believed it yourself. Would have called yourself a Christian. Was it specifically doubts about the existence of God, or was it more the reliability of Scripture and what the Bible says about Jesus that ultimately sort of scuppered that faith you had?
Well, the short answer is yes. I was a believing Christian up to my late-ish 20s, and so lost my faith a bit later than many. And yes, I was brought up in the church and still have enormous love of the church, including church music and the liturgy. And by the way, I mean, it's worth saying that, of course, both of which throughout my lifetime, like in previous generations, have been thrown away by the people who are meant to guard it. And that certainly doesn't help, although it doesn't cause it. By the way, as a little offshoot of that, I should mention that one of the warning, interesting things that's happening at the moment is that almost everywhere I go, there are people who are Tridentine Catholics, and they're young.
Yes.
Well, small but significant development, which you might have, you wouldn't have had 20 years ago.
No, and even on the Protestant side, a move towards in some quarters, millennials suddenly realizing the value of the Anglo-Catholic tradition as well, and sort of
maybe.
Yeah.
I think it's an interesting thing to keep to notice. Anyhow, I wrote about my own issues on this in a piece in about 2009 in the Spectator titled "Mohammed Made Me an Atheist," and it explained how having to have studied in depth another religion than the one I was brought up in was like being taken around the back of a theatre and being shown all the workings. And it changed the way I saw the religion from which I came and the religion which I then believed. and yeah, it's I could go on a lot longer than that, but that's shorthand.
Yeah. Be interested in your response to that, Esther. Obviously, you're someone who wants to believe true things just as much as Douglas does, but you obviously having looked into the historicity issues yourself, aren't as pessimistic, I'm guessing, on the outcomes.
Slightly less, yes. So yeah, I read Douglas's piece, and I've read a number of other things that he's written and said. And I remember, Douglas, you mentioned in that piece, you said that it was the sort of German higher criticism that did it, and you sort of touch on that a bit in sorry, did you want to jump in?
No. I say yes, you're right, and I know that there's a critique that I have read now debunked German higher critics.
Well, it's funny because you talk about how we can't unlearn this. It's like, well, actually, a great many things have been unlearned since then. But so. You said, but at the end, it was Muhammad who made you an atheist because of that sort of short, sharp line. Well, your guy didn't hear voices, but mine did, and that was it. That was sort of the bit that got to you at the end. But my experience is that the more that I know, the more confident that I am that actually the documents that we have, particularly the New Testament, where I think is where we have the most light, although we have light in the Old as well. The more I read, the more convinced I am. I think the accounts that we have of Jesus' life and death and resurrection are quite holistically reliable. And I know that Hume is often sort of cited as this sort of everlasting check. And then we have Matthew Arnold saying miracles do not happen, so that no matter what, the miraculous explanation must always be the least probable one, in essence. But that's actually not true. I don't want to bore people with the long explanation of why that's the case. But these things have to be judged point by point on the field of evidence. There's no sort of epistemic silver bullet. And I think with Islam and Christianity, there are a number of quite fundamental disanalogies when it comes to evaluating their respective truth claims.
And by the way, I should stress the journey I outlined there is not by any means an inevitable one. I mean, I would think that I might be editorializing a bit for him, but reading Tom Holland's books over the last 20 years, I think Tom Holland, for instance, is an example of somebody who looked at Islam and then looked back at Christianity and found the claims within Christianity to be more plausible than he had remembered, or perhaps knew when he set back out. So that's an example of somebody who obviously can go perfectly easily, not easily, can move back.
Yes, I actually know Tom a bit. We've corresponded somewhat, and he's, I don't want to speak for him, but he's quite open at this point, I think, to that reexamination.
And interestingly, jives so very well with what you're saying as well, Douglas. So I only very recently had Tom Holland on my show. He was debating A.C. Grayling on the value of Christianity and whether it gave us our human rights. And obviously this is on the back of Tom's big new book, Dominion. Have you had a chance to read it, by the way, Douglas? Just yes. I mean, what do you think of that? Because in a way, a lot of what Tom is saying there seems to dovetail so well with your book, which is that we don't realise just how much we've come to depend and we swim in, essentially, a Judeo-Christian view of history and ethics to the degree that I think Tom is quite worried, actually, about what the future may hold in the absence of that.
Yes, that's my reading of his work. I think that he is a part of a very interesting development in the last 2 decades, which is basic. I mean, to give it, I think what the historians will read into this is something like this. They will say that at the beginning of the 21st century, a deeply secularized West became alert to religion again because of 9/11 and started to find the critique of religion in the critique of all religion, and that this was a safe way to go in a way, and that the rise of new atheism in the 2000s was an expression of revulsion towards what 9/11, its precursors, and what succeeded it demonstrated about a form of religion. The safe way to attack this was to attack religion as a whole and to say that religions are all equally bad. And then during the decade we're currently in, as I say, I think Tom Holland's a very important example of this, it became possible to say, no, maybe some religions are worse than others, or some religions are better than others. And then at some point that inevitably is going to lead you to, and this is the one I back in some way. So I think that will be seen as being the historical movement that's happened in maybe not in a very large number of people, but in a segment of people, certainly, thinking people. I mean, I know there are too many sort of interesting examples of this at this stage, of people I know, some of whom are public figures, informing themselves about this.
I think it's a super interesting time in that way. And I just wonder whether this may be, to some extent, the intellectual sort of backlash almost against a rather unthinking dismissal of all religion. And to some extent, whether it may even be part of, some longer, tide coming back in on Matthew Arnold's speech, where actually religion is going to be taken seriously again in, more intellectual circles and that kind of thing. I mean, what would it take for you, I suppose? That's the question I'd love to ask you at this point, Douglas, as we start to draw things to a close. What would it take for you personally to kind of make that journey back, to see the tide come in again? Is it just a really long chat with Esther where she convinces you of the reliability of the Gospels, or is there a bit more to it?
I think I'd need to hear a voice.
What kind? A voice? Oh, literally, a voice from beyond.
I mean it literally.
Okay.
By the way, I'm very interested in the absence of this sort of discussion within the religious discussion. I was having a very interesting late night argument the other week at Oxford University after a talk I was doing there. And I don't think I'm breaking any confidences, but we got arguing about religion in the early hours after a couple of pints of Negroni. And I said there to some religious people I was arguing with, have any of you ever heard voices or had a vision? And I was very struck by the fact that the main thing happened was that one of them immediately flipped, said, I know exactly what you're trying to do. You're trying to make us fall into that trap. And then you're going to dismiss the whole thing and declare victory and we'll And the reason I mentioned this is because I said, actually, that is exactly the opposite of what I was doing. I was inviting you to do the thing that will make you exhaust yourself most swiftly. And I said to them, I've known two people in my life who claim to have had an actual experience of God like that. Not I've had feelings of, or sometimes I feel X, but one, both of them now dead, one who believed she heard the voice of God and wasn't a maniac by any means, was a very devout man throughout his life. And the other was a friend who became a priest on the basis of a vision, basically, when he was a young man. And I just mention this because, as I mentioned it to these people at Oxford the other week, because it strikes me so vividly that I would urge people not to fake it, needless to say. But it strikes me that that's not in the mix at all in what people are discussing about Western Christianity. I have traveled quite widely in the Middle East, Africa, and elsewhere, and noticed that for instance, the churches in Africa, what I've just described isn't common, but it wouldn't be thought to be completely mad if you said it.
Sure. Yeah.
Whereas, and I mention this just because I'm interested in the absence of that. And when I say that, as I say, I assume that religious people will think I'm trying to lead them into some trap. I'm not. I'm saying that is and has historically been one of the ways in which the Christian religion has thrived.
So
by instant visions.
Yeah. I mean, Esther, Douglas is looking for some kind of experience, and says maybe we should expect a bit more
I'm
of
not
it.
looking for, I'm saying that the bar is that high.
The bar is that high. Okay, fair enough. What's your response to that, Esther?
Well, I mean, I'm put in mind of Ebenezer Scrooge a bit. You know, should you have such an experience, one could always, you know, like if a voice spoke to Peter Atkins, he would say that it was just a bit of undigested potato, you know. And I can personally say I have never heard voices or a voice. That's not an experience that I've been given. Although, as Douglas points out, one does hear stories sometimes in the less developed countries, Africa, the Middle East. You do frequently hear stories, for example, of Muslims who say, Jesus visited me in a dream and said, "Why are you persecuting me?" And now I'm a Christian. So those are quite interesting stories that you might want to have a look at. But you know, I think I would disagree. That rather what I should say is I would disagree that the bar should be set that high, because I would say, you know, if we were convinced that this was true, that the truth claims were true, that Christ had become incarnate, had died, had ministered, healed the sick, raised the dead, and then in the end risen himself from the dead. If we could be convinced of those things, it, you know, much the same way we're convinced of anything in history, then I don't see why we shouldn't believe it, even if we never heard voices.
No. I should stress, I'm not by any means saying that people shouldn't believe it if they haven't got to that level of evidential proof that I'm saying. And I should stress, I'm not even saying that I'm not I haven't set my bar that high, you know. Okay. I'm saying that at this stage, that is what it would require as I see it at the moment. That isn't to say that it couldn't be satisfied lower, but that's just my instinct when asked what would be needed.
Do you feel like were that day to ever arrive, Douglas? And this reminds me a little bit of where I find Jordan Peterson, interestingly, in this conversation, again, who has spoken so eloquently and in many different ways about the value of religion. And if you sometimes you read his 12 Rules for Life, you'd think you were reading a Christian apologist at some points when he talks about the way in which we need those Genesis narratives to tell us about the value of human life and dignity and everything else. But has never felt able to really say, no, I believe in God. It's a very qualified version of God, if it is a God at all.
Well, I think he takes the same opt-out I do, slightly of accepting Cardinal Ratzinger's invitation to live as though God exists.
As though God exists, right? And to some extent, I almost wonder though whether anyone who finally does, as it were, play their cards in that way, nail their colours to that mast and say, no, call me a believer, do they then kind of get excluded from the conversation? Are you allowed to sit down with a Sam Harris or a whoever and have the conversation if you say, actually, no, I believe there is a God. He came to us in Jesus Christ and rose from the dead? Because to some extent, I think it's seen as, okay, you can't join the adult conversation anymore in some circles if you actually hold those kinds of specific
I'd
beliefs.
be sorry if there was any circles so close-minded as to take that view. As I say, my own view is that at the very least, to engage with devout believers is to engage with people who are engaging and have engaged very deeply with a well of thought that is considered everything. And it would be a foolish thing to cut yourself off from that. So no, I don't think anyone can be or is excluded. I know what you mean, that there might be a type of conversation with a type of scientist that might run against certain barriers. But even that, I've had that conversation with religious and non-religious scientists, and it's not been a problem. The one thing I would say on that is, maybe I should just add one thing to my, as it were, the bar I was suggesting. I mean, I suppose one thing that often holds, let's say, intellectuals back is can I make this leap in a way that is intellectually satisfiable, or at least can I do it in a way that allows me not to have to volunteer up, even a part of my sense of intellectual honesty or self-worth or self-esteem, as it were. And that isn't the way, that genuinely isn't the way in which I view this. If I could, I would, but I can't.
Okay.
And I would just add to that. I mean, I was in great fortune to travel a fair amount in the Middle East in my life, and I was in Israel again earlier this year, and traveled around Galilee a lot, in particular. And I came back, and a friend who recently converted to Catholicism in recent years said to me, what did you feel anything?
Yeah.
And I said to him, some a very private thought I had, but I said I did on that trip to Galilee in particular. I did end up having one sentence in my head that I couldn't get out, which was, something happened here. Something happened here.
Something. Esther, our time is drawing to a close. It's been so interesting, and thank you, Douglas, for sharing so honestly as well. We've kind of given you a bit of a spiritual grilling towards the end here, and we do appreciate the
I've had worse.
The willingness to engage. Esther, any final thoughts as we close out today's show?
I think I would just close with a brief story about the one time that Winston Churchill met the American evangelist Billy Graham. This was in the 50s after the war, and Churchill, after the war, we now know, was in a quite bleak state, a rather depressed state. They had only a few minutes together. And at one point, Churchill looked Billy Graham in the eye and he said, "I'm a man without hope. Do you have any real hope for me?" And with some slight trepidation, perhaps, Graham pulled out his New Testament and he said, "Mr. Prime Minister, I have a good deal of hope." And I would say that it is that same hope that I would extend to you now, Douglas, because you seem like a man who could use it. And it truly is my sincere prayer that as Eliot has it, you would not cease from exploration. At the end of all your exploring would be to arrive where you started and know it for the first time. So that would be what I would leave you with.
One of my favorite bits of Eliot.
Look, it's been so good having you both on. Really appreciate the time, Douglas and Esther. Thank you so much for being with us. You can find out more about both of them. And of course, do go and get a hold of a copy of The Madness of Crowds. It's available wherever books are sold, and there's a link from it from today's show. But for the moment, Douglas and Esther, thank you for being with me.
Thank you very much. My pleasure.
For more conversations between Christians and skeptics, subscribe to the Unbelievable podcast. And for more updates and bonus content, sign up to the Unbelievable newsletter.